It's Darren.
Okay. Good morning. Good morning. Darren Springer, Chief Operating Officer, Burlington Electric Department. Thank you for inviting me to be here today. And I prepared a PowerPoint that I understand I don't need to bring paper copies for, which is great. Thank you very much. Oh, I can even use mine. So thanks for having me here to talk about H396. I thought that, and perhaps it's a little less necessary given Ed McNamara's testimony, but I thought I might just walk through a little bit of the evolution of how we've treated net metering recs through the past several years, several iterations of different legislation to get to where we are today, and the rationale for that. I was going to raise a couple of concerns that we had with the legislation, regretfully, but also offer some ideas for alternative approaches as well. So prior to Act 99, which was the net metering bill from 2014, Vermont did not have a renewable energy standard, and we did not have provisions in net metering that really addressed recs. So you had a situation where, as a customer or as a developer or a utility, anybody who had a net metering project was fully capable of selling the renewable energy credits out of state as part of financing for the project. There were examples of that, certainly. There were examples where folks kept the recs. In that legislative or statutory environment, this bill might have had a different impact in looking at this. But so that was the situation prior to the 2014 legislation. The 2014 legislation, for the first time ever in Vermont's dealings with recs and with energy, set up some provisions around how we're going to treat recs from net metering projects. So for the first time, a customer would have to say to the Public Service Board when they apply to be a net metering customer, I want to keep the recs or I want to transfer them to the utility. And this was prior to having a renewable energy standard, but it was in anticipation that we might have one. I believe that provision was inserted, and if the utility received the renewable energy credits, they had to retire them, retain them and retire them. They could not sell them out of state to address that concern that had been raised. And so that was the change from Act 99, which was 2014. And then obviously Act 56, the renewable energy standard, followed a year later and made further changes to how we treated net metering recs, setting up the Tier 2 requirement that Ed McNamara was just talking about, where we have an in-state requirement for renewable energy development that's associated with recs. Net metering counts towards the Tier 2. That legislation canceled the speed program, so we no longer had the double counting issue with Connecticut that Ed had referenced. And there was a provision in there that said if the customer keeps the recs from net metering, then the board would, in designing a new program, reduce the amount of compensation that they would receive, the amount of credit that they would receive. If the customer provides the recs to the utility to help meet the state's renewable goals, they'd receive a higher level of compensation. But the legislation didn't spell out exactly what that would be. It left it to the board to determine. In January of this year, we had a report from the Public Service Board, and looking at net metering, I want to say that we actually have done quite a bit compared to other states in the region. 172 megawatts, 16.7% of peak. That's a fairly impressive total. As I think we mentioned last time we were here, Burlington has lagged a little behind that. I think we're around 10.7% of peak for a variety of reasons, but we're working on ways to help our customers who want a net meter have new opportunities to do so. And the report from the Public Service Board did raise a concern that under the old program that there were recs sold out of state and that they wanted to have a program that would ensure that recs from net metering could be used to meet our renewable goals. So that was in that January report. Here's a quote from it that I won't read to you, but it makes that same point about wanting to keep the recs in state to meet our goals from net metering. And the net metering program that was rolled out, the rules that were rolled out by the Public Service Board, put that into action, basically saying if a customer wants to provide the recs to the utility to meet the renewable goals for the state, they get a 3-cent per kilowatt hour increase over a 10-year period to help provide a financial compensation to the customer. If the customer keeps the renewable energy credits, they get a 3-cent decrease in the compensation, so there's a 6-cent swing essentially for the customer, depending on if they keep or if they sell the rec to the utility. And that is incidentally, or perhaps not incidentally, maybe unintentionally, the alternative compliance level for Tier 2. So they looked at what that would be, which is 6 cents, and they put that into the net metering program for a customer. Notably, the customer has to make the election one time, and then the utility can plan on whether that REC and that system will be providing RECs for Tier 2 and for net metering to the utility, or whether the customer is keeping the RECs. And something that we certainly appreciate, there's no double counting, there's no ambiguity around it. Either the customer has the REC or the utility has the REC, but it's a REC equals 1 megawatt hour of renewable generation, so it can only be used once, and that is the case with the current rules. Just a few concerns with the approach from H396. As I mentioned, in the Public Service Board rules, we have a one-time decision by the customer. Am I keeping the RECs, or am I transferring to the utility? This would require an annual process, so a customer might decide to keep them for a year and might decide to try to transfer them the year following, and it would create some administrative complexity, I think, in planning for utilities, particularly as net metering continues to get further and further towards scale. And I'll say this as somebody who worked on the regulatory side and with some of you on legislation on net metering in the past, and maybe was occasionally dismissive of some of the administrative complexities of dealing with utility billing systems and other types of things. I think my appropriate punishment has been to go to a utility and have to sit in a number of meetings looking at a number of permutations for net metering and figuring out with my colleagues how we can do rate codes for those and et cetera. So I certainly wouldn't downplay the administrative complexity piece. I've seen it firsthand, and it's a legitimate concern. But most importantly for us, I think, and as Ed McNamara laid out, the certainty that we've had with the renewable energy standard of being able to access the REC markets in New England, to be able to sell RECs, and certainly we purchase RECs as well from Burlington Electric, has a revenue benefit for our customers, for our ratepayers, and having that certainty from the 2015 law is very, very critical. And we wouldn't want to do anything to undermine that or to look as if we're doing something different or inconsistent with any of the other New England states when it comes to how we account for RECs. And the concern would be, even though we're trying to reduce the amount in this bill, that we'd be creating a situation where a customer would be getting credit essentially for the renewable energy certificate, but the utility would also be having its obligation changed, and there could be a concern, I think, about whether that's a new form of double counting. We certainly would want to avoid that. That said, I did promise a few ideas around addressing the issue because I appreciate the intent of the legislation. Ed mentioned a couple of these, but obviously one immediate item is a customer certainly can retain the RECs. I mean, I think it's important to remember that we have a choice, and if a customer wants to do so, that tends to be because they want to make a legal claim to ownership of the RECs. So sometimes a business might say, I want to say to my customers that I'm 100% solar powered or I'm 100% renewable. And if they want to do that, they're certainly able to under the net metering program, but they will receive a lower level of compensation because they're not providing the same level of value to the utility that another customer who is providing the REC would be doing. I understand that may not work for every customer, but that's certainly an option. Burlington Electric, just like we talked about Cow Power with Green Mountain Power, we've been talking with our electric commission about exploring our own green pricing program for customers who are interested in purchasing RECs to be able to make these types of claims, to be able to say that they've retired RECs and they're a 100% renewable business or a 100% renewable educational institution or whatever it might be. So we're looking actively at exploring that for these same reasons to help this group of customers who might be interested in that. And the last item I would say, and I'll say it with the caveat that certainly the Public Service Board, Public Service Department would have to work with us to figure out this piece. But I think a lot of customers, I say this as a net metering customer myself, and I've gone through the process, I think a lot of customers want to make sure when they're net metering that their renewable energy credits aren't being sold out of state, that they're not helping another state meet its goals, but they want to know that they're helping us meet our own goals. And under the current program, I think they can feel comfortable doing that. I think that the customers who want to keep the RECs are probably looking to make a legal claim or having some sort of validation there. Perhaps there's some way that we can have a customer recognition approved through the Public Service Board or department to be able to say, as a customer, my system is helping my utility meet our renewable energy goals. Not a legal claim, not a marketing claim, but just something that we'd be able to acknowledge the customer has provided the RECs to the utility, and the utility is using them to meet our renewable energy standards. So I don't have specific language around that, but that's certainly something that I know has been discussed in the past. And if the board and department had an idea around that, certainly from the Burlington Electric Department perspective, we'd be happy to work with them and with you on that idea. And that concludes my presentation. I'd certainly be happy to answer questions if you have.
I appreciate you coming in, and also we appreciate the suggestions. And so stepping back, I mean, you're right about the legal claim to being green, that it's of value to businesses, institutions, things like that. I think there's also the aspect that if a generator keeps the RECs, that, I mean, legally and understandably, that's not counted toward the state portfolio.
That's right.
But it's energy, green energy that is created and used in Vermont and isn't accounted for, isn't tracked. There's no benefit to it other than the customer being able to have bragging rights.
Right.
And so I guess that's one of the approaches I was looking for, is how does the state is greener because of it. How do we recognize that to the benefit of the state and the utilities?
Right.
And I don't know the mechanism within the accounting system.
Right. I think, we're obviously, as a state, we're a little later to the renewable energy standard conversation than some of the states that have gone before us. But I think even in a lot of the states that have had renewable energy standards, there continues to be a market for voluntary renewable procurement for the reasons that we're talking about, whether it's through carbon offsets or RECs or other types of programs where somebody wants to make a claim. I think that certainly there would continue to be customers, certainly there are pre-existing customers before we went through the process, who haven't necessarily done anything with their RECs. They haven't necessarily registered them and sold them, but they may not have transferred them to the utility. So there's sort of some value there. I think you're right that they're retaining as a customer because of the old system that we're not necessarily accounting for. But I think the key shift for me is, in thinking about it, is we moved from a system where I think under the old programs, where we didn't have a statewide REC retirement program, there might have been customers who legitimately wanted to put in solar and say, I want to make sure my RECs are staying in Vermont. I want to make sure they're not being used for compliance somewhere else. I think we've moved now to a system where we're saying collectively we've got state goals that our utilities are going to help us meet, and we've put a thumb on the scale towards trying to move as hard as we can in that direction. So I think you're right, there continue to be some customers that have RECs that may not monetize them. I think it's a low enough number certainly for us in our territory that we're not too concerned about it, but we'd certainly be willing to work with you to think that through a little more.
Okay.
Yeah.
Kurt.
Darren, just a question about the 16.7% that solar makes up, and that's great. And so the energy is 172 megawatts. How does that look kilowatt hours or megawatt hours?
Right. So when we talk about solar making up the vast majority of net metering, and solar capacity factor being could be 14%, could be 20% on the higher end. But so you can take that peak and you probably divide it by 4 or 5 to get the energy output roughly, very roughly. So solar from net metering, while at a peak time might be a very significant resource. If there's no clouds and we're at peak and it's in the summertime for a summer peaking utility like us, other utilities maybe winter peaking have a different situation. But the energy output from those systems would be, you take the 16.7%, maybe divided by 4 to 5, depending on the capacity factor, and you'd have a lower percentage, obviously, of energy output compared to sales.
You don't know what that is?
I don't want to give you a figure that's incorrect. So I would say it's probably in the low single digits, but we could certainly confirm that. And we have our own numbers in Burlington. The number I cited here is from the Public Service Board report, so it's a statewide figure, the 16.7.
So the formula is 172, in this case, divided by 4.
Well, no, I think it'd be more like the 16.7. So the percentage of peak divided by 4 or 5 to get the percentage of sales would be a rough calculation from my perspective. Yeah. So you'd probably be in the relatively growing fairly significantly over time, over the last several years, but still in the low single digits in terms of the energy from net metering systems. I know that folks from the Public Service Board are here could probably correct me if I missed that.
Kind of think with the public service, I would have to check the numbers too, but I think as a general matter, Darren's about the right range.
Warren.
Well, this is more of a general question, since we're talking about the solar generation. We talk about this behind the meter. So if I look at these numbers, say, maybe they're not here, but ISO, they give renewable energy generation for solar. It looks minuscule. Is that because they don't have behind the meter numbers, or not? We're talking about what percentage solar takes up, and do people have these? I mean, somehow the behind the meter numbers are available, because how else would they know how to figure out what bill credits are? But do they get reported to ISO, and does that come into their numbers or not?
So, do you want to?
Sure, we can both. In the ISO numbers, you have to remember too that, I mean, the short answer is yes, behind the meter is a big part of that, because especially with ISO, in terms of their real-time numbers, they're only looking at facilities that are larger than 5 megawatts. That's the only data that gets reported directly to ISO. So there's not a solar facility in Vermont that would currently
not yet.
right would currently be above that threshold. So
Okay.
So, you know, if you have a behind-the-meter net metering system to somebody like ISO, it might just look like the load is changing,
Right,
the load shape is changing. Okay. And we had a representative from ISO on a panel that I was on a month or so ago, and they're very conscious of this issue. I know they have a solar kind of a working group to do more accurate projections, to look at these issues, because they want to know what the load shape's going to be, and they want to know what generation's on the system. So it's an active conversation, but it would look a little different to them than a 20 megawatt solar generator or a 10 megawatt solar generator, where they'd have very direct access to that.
Thanks.
Anyone else? Robin?
The concept of an annual certification or something, I can certainly understand that as being problematic. And I mean, it seems to me this could be a condition of the CPG that would be up for renewal if the property changes hands or something like that. But
Certainly that'd be less complicated for us. I know that in looking at the current rules, which we've spent a number of meetings, and it's been very interesting to me to see this, but there's the whole class of sort of pre-existing customers, and we have to track where they are in getting their 10-year solar adder, and when that expires, and what the rules are that apply to them at that time. And then the new rules obviously have some 10-year windows in them as well for siting and rec adjusters, and then those customers have to change over. And then there's the variations between residential and community, or somebody's on a commercial rate versus a residential rate, and how those work. So there's a fair amount of complexity in it. I think, just to be clear from the Burlington Electric perspective, I think we had our views, and other utilities and stakeholders all had their views, but we do view the current Public Service Board rules as being very workable for us and a fair compromise. So we're not necessarily seeking any change to those at this point in time, but certainly anything that was added to them that was annual would be more complex than something that was less than annual. So I certainly concede that point.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Let's take 10 minutes.
I'd be happy
For the
to
committee
continue the conversation.
Same here.
Be back at half past.
Come on, let's go.
Okay.
I think in
Everybody hear that?
Yeah, I got it.
Mr. Chair,
this would have been something that
I'm from Office of Legislative Counsel. I just wanted to let you know that I'm covering
there were probably a lot of
Darren,
customers.
so if you